when people are tired or stressed out or mentally fatigued. We've all experienced that feeling at the end of the day. How can natural sounds play a role in helping people recover from those states?
Hello, dear listener, and welcome back or welcome to Conversations in the Canopy. For this episode, we're going to explore a sensory world that we may take for granted. To begin, I'm going to ask you to stop for a moment, if you can. Close your eyes and heighten your sense of hearing. Listen to the obvious and louder sounds around you. Once you've tuned into these, try and seek the subtle sounds, those that are ambient, quite difficult to tune into. What can you hear? Are they anthropogenic? That is, human-made noises? My voice talking to you right now certainly is, as is the TV in the other room, the car engine outside, or the construction work over the road. What else can you hear? Can you hear noises produced by the geophysical environment, like wind blowing through trees or raindrops falling on a surface? Can you hear any sounds produced by living organisms? Are there birds singing in the background? Can you hear dogs barking? And is that anthropogenic or is that a natural soundscape? Depending on where you're listening, you will be experiencing different levels of these sounds in your environment. Most likely, unless you're listening to me on a walk in the middle of a woodland or on a deserted beach, you can probably hear mostly anthropogenic sounds. These sounds make up our modern era soundscape. For a long time, as with our landscapes, soundscapes were not dominated by humans. Yet, as civilizations grew, we began to increase the amount of noise we emitted in ever-changing forms. And we didn't listen. We didn't listen to what our human actions were doing to natural soundscapes, and in tandem, what the lack of natural soundscapes was doing to us. So to tell us about our modern understanding of sound, we have Alex Smalley joining me for a walk. Alex Smalley is a research fellow at Exeter University and the Wellcome Trust. He researches ephemeral moments in nature, soundscapes, and explores how digital experiences of nature can impact well-being. Alex's work has been inspired by others such as Ellie Ratcliffe, Sarah Payne, and Sarah Bell, who were some of the first people to take the impacts of natural sound seriously in the UK. And Alex has an important message for us. Those special moments in life would not feel the same without that all-important ingredient of... Throughout this episode, you'll hear the ambient sounds of Eden's waterfall. Without further ado, let's walk through the rainforest with Alex. So Alex, welcome to the Eden Project. Welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And how are you feeling walking around it?
I mean, I'm certainly struck by a sense of awe that I hadn't had for a little while. Just the scale of the biome and the scale of the plants that are in here, the palms. Just even looking up at this one, it's huge. And so I definitely feel a sense of, I feel smaller than I would do normally, I think, right now in here.
And we're appreciating some wonderful visuals right now as we walk through here. And I get quite lost in appreciating visuals. But right now, around me, I can hear a waterfall. I can hear British native birds, as well as the rules that we have in this biome. And I appreciate the sound now, but when I'm out and about outside of this biome, I don't normally take into account what sound is doing to me. And I guess this leads us into what you specialise in, what your research is on. So can you tell us a bit about that?
All right, so I was actually struck as we first walked through the doors into the biome. It was the soundscape that hit me before I saw anything else. There was the sense of humidity, but also, like you say, the soundscape, that backdrop of water flowing, and the passerine birds, the wren. There's a couple of wrens in here that are absolutely going for it. And the point you make about people sensing environments visually, I think what researchers over the last sort of 10, 15 years identified was that there was a bit of a gap there, that we talked about natural environments according to their visual characteristics, whether they were green, whether they were blue, whether they had water in them, the amount of trees, the type of trees. And there was a big gap with not really researchers, the academic community, paying attention to the way that sounds impacted people psychologically and the role that they played in their experience of nature. So I think a lot of people will be familiar with thinking about sound as noise. So for decades now, we've definitely had the situation where sounds in the environment, particularly sounds in towns and cities, are viewed through a negative lens. What are the sounds that we need to reduce, eradicate? And that typically is the sound of traffic, the sound of people, the sound of industry, building sites. And what a focus on noise pollution ended up doing with sound was treating it as a negative resource rather than thinking about the positive sides that we need to bring back in. Because of course, if we eradicate all of the negative sounds, we're not aiming for silence. What are the positive sounds that should be in there? And researchers started to think about this towards the end of the 90s and in the early noughties. And top of that list was the sounds of nature. And we sort of took on the baton 4 or 5 years ago and started to think very specifically about how different kinds of sounds can contribute to this idea of restoration in nature. When people are tired or stressed out or mentally fatigued, we've all experienced that feeling at the end of the day. How can natural sounds play a role in helping people recover from those states?
And I guess a difficulty for people is that they live in these urban environments which are very convenient, but they lack natural sounds like the one we're walking into right now.
That's true. And yet, this was thrown into really sharp focus through the pandemic, that actually those natural sounds are still there in many places. So the classic is your sort of rooftop bird, something like a blackbird, or even robins and wrens, the hedgerow species. I think that people's attention was drawn to those kinds of sounds a lot more in lockdown because the traffic noise was diminished and people could hear them. But once you hear them, it's very hard to sort of unhear them. Once you know they're there, then as the traffic noise comes back, and I'm sort of speaking anecdotally now, it's a bit like a sort of sense that is forgotten, I think, that we can hear lots of these elements of the natural world. And for me, it's almost a bit like a superpower. If you have a very small amount of knowledge about the way that different birds sound, when you walk past a hedgerow, you might just see a hedge, it might just be a yew, or it might just be a laurel. But when you can hear the different bird species that are in there, all of a sudden, there's actually real biodiversity here. There's 3 or 4 or 5 different species that I can hear, even though I can't see them. And biodiversity is a really exciting thing to be aware of, because there's certainly research that shows that biodiverse environments might be a lot better at helping to improve people's well-being when they spend time in them.
And so naturally we have a draw to these more biodiverse environments?
I've got to phrase a response to that. That's a slightly nascent area. Yes, so it certainly looks like biodiversity is an important part of the experience of nature. You can imagine going to a football field and it's just grass versus that same environment full with different types of species. And there's elements of novelty there. It can spark people's curiosity. But if we bring it back to sound for a second, the more diverse the soundscape is, the more that's going on in it, the richer that is. And we talk a lot in restoration research about this idea of soft fascination, this principle that when you spend time in natural environments, it gives you a break from busy urban environments where your attention is demanded all the time, but you don't want to turn your attention completely off. You don't want to stare at a blank wall. And this is where the idea of soft fascination comes in. You want enough stimuli in your environment so that your attention is just very gently captured. And that allows these other parts of your brain that have been fatigued, tired out during the day to recover. And sound is a lovely way to do that.
I know from my psychology research in the past that different landscapes have an impact on us. So as humans, we feel much more relaxed in kind of a savanna with a couple of trees is our perfect environment. Think of the grasslands as we came out of the forests. But forests can be maybe overstimulating visually for us, and we can feel a bit of threat because we can't see too far ahead. But how does that equate in terms of soundscapes? Are there certain soundscapes that are better, like is a jungle soundscape threatening maybe to us Europeans?
We looked at this very specifically actually in a study that we just published last year, where we took a kind of quite a reductionist approach where we said, okay, well, if there are, natural soundscapes are composed of lots of different sources. So the sounds of water is a classic, the sound of birdsong is another, but that across the world, you're exactly right, what constitutes the sort of sound of the landscape in some places will be very different. You might, be living next to a flowing river. You might be in a place where it rains really heavily a lot of the time. And the same thing with the sort of sound of fauna. Typically that might be birdsong, but in a rural environment, it might be the sound of farm animals like sheep. And so we sort of broke soundscapes down across the world according to these constituents. And what we found consistently was that the sound of birdsong was really, really important. And other researchers had done this and had looked at sound, but what was key was that when you compared the sounds of particularly passerine birds in the UK with the sound of flowing water, birdsong always came out on top. And when you put those two things together, birdsong was still the important ingredient in there. And one of the other things we did with that paper was we said, okay, what if we start to lose that biodiversity that we think is so crucial to experiences in nature? What if we take the birdsong out and just leave the sounds of, a babbling brook or heavy rain falling on leaves? And what we saw was that people's ratings of feelings of fascination, of feelings of restoration dropped. And what was important about that was that people weren't making a comparison between one soundscape and the other, and yet there was something in them that when those sounds of birds weren't there, that the experience felt impoverished.
Okay, interesting. And so I guess with greater urbanization, we lose the birds that are around us, and so our soundscape experience becomes impoverished.
That is one sort of way to frame, I think, the experience of life in towns and cities. But of course, the other is that these elements can be sought out and reintroduced. So if we think about the preservation of green spaces in towns and cities, the introduction of green roofs, there's lots of urban greening initiatives, the sort of creation of micro-habitats in the form of allotments. There's lots of opportunities to design those spaces with rich soundscapes in mind. And I think that was one of the things that I and other researchers who were doing this work in sound was very passionate about, putting sound back on the agenda not just thinking about these visual elements.
Certainly in towns and cities, as we've mentioned, the experience could be getting impoverished, and it's good that maybe local governments pay attention to this research that you and other researchers are doing, and they bring back green spaces to encourage these native birds. But if people can't access natural green spaces, are there other avenues? And I guess I'm pointing you towards your research into virtual sound environments.
So that's something that, we thought about a lot, and in tandem with the research that we've done on sound, because of course all of the experimental work that we've done has used these digital recordings as proxies for hearing the sounds in the real world. And one of the wonderful things about sound is that it can provide this very sort of deeply immersive experience without the need to rely on visuals. So you can provide a sort of shared experience, and we think sound could be a really powerful way to bring some of those experiences of nature to people who might be stuck indoors for a host of reasons. And again, the pandemic provided an example there where everyone got to feel what it was like when they were stuck at home. Everyone got to feel what it was like if they couldn't go for a walk down to their local park or take the dog out on the beach, because they weren't allowed to drive to these spaces. And there are so many people, not just in the UK, but across the world, who find themselves in situations like that, whether they're recovering from major surgery and stuck in clinical settings, whether they're in long-term assisted living or end-of-life care. There are people who simply just can't get outside, possibly at times in their life when they might need to the most. So we think that these digital versions of nature, rather than replacing the experiences of nature for people who can get outside, we think they can bring them to people when they can't. People experience nature in all sorts of different ways, and it's once you make people aware of it, they next time they're watching nature on TV, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm not just watching TV, I'm experiencing the natural world in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. I'm not just watching TV. This isn't just after Corrie. There is something else going on there.
When I was looking through some of your research, there were connections to ephemeral phenomena. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
It sounds like a bit of a mouthful, doesn't it? But actually I find it quite an evocative phrase, this idea that there are ephemeral moments in the natural world that can actually come to really define our experiences in nature. And the reason I think that's a really important thing to think about is because we often view the experience of nature as static. Well, if I go to this mountain range or this forest, it's always going to look the same. But of course, it's not. It's going to change from day to day, but also very much from moment to moment. So we ran a study that explored how people responded to natural environments at different times in the day, whether there was a sunrise or a sudden storm bubble up or a rainbow after that storm. And what we found was that ephemeral moments like sunrise and sunset were really valued. People found them more beautiful, and crucially, they found them more awe-inspiring than these other moments in the day. So we were comparing those times and those moments to typical sort of what we call blue skies, because much of the research has thought about how people respond to nature under these sort of clement, sunny conditions. But actually what we found was that this experience was greatly enriched at sunrise and sunset, but also that elements like sudden storms and rainbows could really change the way that people experience feelings of awe. And we think awe could be a really powerful emotion to elicit. There's a whole lot of research at the moment coming out of California, from a group in Berkeley, who are showing that awe can be a really, really important emotion to elicit. It can improve pro-social behavior, it can improve positive emotions, it can make people's problems feel less important. And of course, sound is a really wonderful way to also experience these ephemeral moments, these moments that are fleeting and changing. And as we're walking through the soundscape in the biome here, it's constantly changing. It's not the same whether we've got different birds singing. We're moving from one moment. As we approach this waterfall now, the sound of that water is increasing. It's becoming thunderous. I can almost feel the sound rising. And these ephemeral moments don't just rely on vision, they also rely on sound.
And as we come out of that ephemeral moment, I'm feeling kind of joyous that we did that. Not only was it so well timed, but in my body I'm kind of sparkling on the inside right now. It's really nice. So we walk past this waterfall and we come into, for the listeners who've been to the Eden Project, there is a Costa Rica section about Matambu, where we're helping to replant the forest, and the birds have literally pooped the forest back to life. And that is really impactful when you can see what has changed. But to see pictures of it and to be immersed in this, what Eden is, technically an artificial rainforest, is quite a different experience to a virtual rainforest. But we can listen to a virtual rainforest on music apps. We can get soundscapes instantly on our smartphones. And I really want to know whether, because I mean, sometimes if I'm struggling to sleep, I will stick on a rainforest soundtrack, and you know, within 5 to 20 minutes, I'm out for the count. Yet I'm not from a place where there are rainforests, and I don't understand how that makes me feel so relaxed, or how it has this impact on me. I definitely feel more relaxed. Is there any research, or do you have any understanding as to how those environments make us feel so relaxed?
So there's two things going on here. There's one school of thought which talks about this notion of biophilia, that everyone has deep inside of them an innate love for the natural world, whether they know it or not, and that triggers like the sounds of a tropical rainforest, or the sounds of birds, or the sights, like you said, you mentioned the savanna environment earlier, that everyone should have a natural emotional reaction to these places because they're where we evolved. They're, over several million years, the environments that we knew and understood and had learned to live in and adapted to live in. But there's also another school of thought, and these two schools of thought very much overlap and inform each other. It says, well, actually, no, what's really important is it's the memories, it's the cultural attachment, it's the time that you've spent in nature that reinforces and impacts the way that you react when you spend time in an environment. And those two things are going on all the time, and may or may not be competing with each other at different times. But the issue that we have is that people's, and particularly children's, experiences in nature are diminishing. And that means that these opportunities to form memories, to form attachments, to become connected to nature are getting less and less.
And we say this now as we have some kids following us around the biome. I guess places like this, where you know we can put on exhibitions that draw children in, but they get to be with the natural world, and maybe they see it as a secondary part of their environment. It's not a primary activity. So I wonder if there is an initiative to kind of get kids in nature through different means.
I mean, that's something that lots of people are definitely exploring, the way that you engage children with the natural world when they're younger. But places like Eden Project, I think, also you could view as slightly dystopian, in the sense that we and other people have imagined a world not in the too distant future where the only place you can experience nature is in an attraction like Eden, because the natural environment has become so degraded that we no longer have, you know, robust natural ecosystems that are self-sufficient, and we have to create these highly managed enclaves. And there was actually an art installation in Austria a few years ago where an artist put 300 trees in a football stadium, live trees, and said, well, look, you know, this is what we're reducing nature to, a spectacle, to come to a football stadium and watch. And this term, that trend has been termed the extinction of experience, which is one of the greatest challenges of our time, potentially.
We're worried about the extinction of plant species, we're about the extinction of fauna. I think humans can be very worried about their own extinction, but the extinction of experience?
Yeah, so this is a phrase that was coined by a researcher, Daniel Pauly, in the mid-90s. Well, actually, he didn't coin extinction of experience, but he laid the foundations for it with his sort of discussion of this idea of shifting baselines, that people accept the level of nature that they grow up with as normal, and then through their lives, if that becomes degraded or diminished, then they lament that, they regret it, and they talk about how it wasn't the same when they were younger. But then successive generations accept that new degraded level as the normal state of the environment. And so we have this problem, which has also been called environmental generational amnesia, because we literally forget what nature is like. And our worry is that if you continue to degrade people's expectations of nature, the end point is this extinction of experience, where people just no longer spend time in natural environments. And then we come back to arguments around how important culture and memory and attachment is, because as much as you can make species extinct in the real world, or even locally extinct, you can also make them extinct in people's minds. This idea of the societal extinction of species, that if you take, say, a particular species of bird out of a natural habitat, by destroying its natural habitat, local populations will forget it exists. Yeah. They'll forget its importance, and so they'll no longer dedicate effort to protecting something that they no longer remember.
Following this thought all the way through, if we continue to urbanize and nature is continually depleted, becomes more and more, our experience of nature becomes more and more impoverished, do we eventually get to a point where urban soundscapes, urban landscapes become our natural world?
I mean, that kind of dystopian future, you could see that as a logical progression. What I'm actually a lot more hopeful than that. And I think all of the efforts that we are, as a global community putting into place to understand the role, the symbiosis that nature has. We often talk about ecosystem services, this idea that healthy and functioning ecosystems provide a whole measure of services to us, like clean water, climate regulation, the provision of food and crops that we just simply couldn't live without. There's a whole other side to that, which is called cultural ecosystem services, the role that nature plays in inspiring art, in facilitating sort of healthy and rich and fulfilled lives. And I think the more that we recognize that, the more that it will be built into the way that we design our towns and cities, so that they can function as habitats as well. And of course, that's my hope, and especially in Western nations, we've got the tools to do that now. And I think we need to make sure that we do it.
Alex makes a great point here. We depend on nature for inspiration, to make sure we do the right things for the planet and for our future. The more nature and wild places that we have, the more likely we are to invest in them. It makes sense. Yet we rarely get to visit truly wild places teeming with biodiversity. But I bet we can all think of a natural history legend who has brought us closer to these spaces over the years. So there's one person that I think the majority of UK, European, maybe even world citizens are fascinated with. And as soon as I say his name, I think everyone already knows who I'm going to say, is David Attenborough. And I was captivated by his documentaries as I grew up. And the BBC was this platform where you could view worlds that were so distant to you and were so magical and almost alien. And as a child, it just made me want to get out into nature. But my backyard for nature was, a couple of kind of dilapidated woods and the jumps where I used to go on my BMX. I know there was some nature connection going on there when I was doing those experiences, but my main port of call for nature connection was probably David Attenborough on TV. And I think many people around the world, no matter what age you are, this is their connection to nature.
I think you're exactly right. And it's actually, we feel like perhaps a really overlooked way that people experience, learn about the natural world are natural history documentaries. And it's something that actually we've just started to think about in our most recent study, because the figures are astounding. You know, you think beyond going for a walk through your local park or your local woodland, or if you're lucky enough to live next to a beach, along a beach or a coast path, routinely for the BBC's large nature documentaries, between sort of 5 and 10 million people tune in to watch the natural world and the stories that are presented within it unfold in front of them from the comfort of their sofas. And for a long time, those programs were designed to educate and entertain. But the more and more that we understand about the way that natural environments can impact our well-being, our psychological health in particular, we really want to understand more about the ways that those forms of, you know, virtual nature, of experiencing nature at home, can impact people psychologically. And so we've actually just run a study that looked at the way that those programs are designed, because of course one of the really iconic elements of a natural history documentary is the music that accompanies it. And lots of people will be familiar that their experiences in the natural world might be accompanied by music. You know, if you go for a run, you're likely to have music in some headphones. If you've ever been to a yoga class or had, you know, sort of holistic therapies, massage, it's likely that music will accompany that experience and be combined with forms of nature. And yet we don't really understand how nature and music can impact people's well-being and whether those two elements compete with one another. You know, there's certainly evidence that suggests that once you introduce what we call anthropogenic sound, you know, the sound of humans, voices, you know, we can hear voices in the biome now. There's evidence that suggests from national parks in the US that those kinds of sounds can actually detract from my experience in lots of different ways. But if we want to encourage lots of different people to experience the natural world, we've got to understand that we're changing the soundscape by being there. So that's the sort of thing that we're starting to look at now.
Yeah, and I think expanding on that anthropogenic soundscape, there's two other main kinds of soundscapes. Can you tell us what they are?
Yeah, so in the field of soundscape ecology, which is this wonderful way of sort of sensing and monitoring the environment, particularly we talked about biodiversity, understanding the way that an ecosystem is composed from different species, but also its health. We can monitor that acoustically. We can listen to the soundscapes. We can spectrally analyze those to understand more about the kind of species that make it up. And crucially, we can spot if they're missing. So soundscape ecology has these three broad categories of sound. One is anthropogenic sound. The other one is sound from the biosphere, you know, the sounds of birdsong is a classic one, the sounds of sort of the living organisms in there. And also this geophysical sound, the sound of, you know, water falling is the iconic one, and flowing, but the sounds of the landscape, you know, wind interacts with the biosphere to create the sound of wind rushing through trees, particularly in a pine forest. These sometimes can be very haunting sounds. So yeah, so natural soundscapes are comprised of these three elements, and a lot of the time the human element is the one we try and reduce.
Three categories make up our soundscape, and we're almost always surrounded by anthropogenic sounds. We're lucky to be able to virtually access natural sounds and images at the touch of our fingertips. Even the sound effects of this podcast are adding some biophonic sounds to your day. It's good to know these things. Knowledge is power and all. But what do virtual nature, ephemeral moments, and natural soundscapes do to us?
Well, the benefits are profound. You know, if you spend time in natural environments or experience nature, even if it's very small doses, to use the medical phrase, you know, whether that's a plant pot, you know, on your desk at work, or whether it's taking a moment to look out at the view if you're lucky enough to have a window. You know, all of these kinds of experiences have been shown to improve people's emotions, you know, so to produce positive emotions, to reduce negative emotions, to help people recover from stress, to help people feel more creative. So the benefits are huge. And I think building in these little moments of nature into your daily life doesn't have to be very difficult, as long as you're thinking about it just enough that you can change your routine a little bit. So if we think about, the fact that sunrise and sunset can produce these wonderful feelings of awe when people see them. At this time of year, it's February now, sunrise in the west of the country is about 7 o'clock. So you've only got to get up a little bit earlier to catch sunrise if you can. And the same with sunsets at about 5:30, 5:45 at the moment. If you can coincide your walk or your commute home from work at that time, you've got a chance of catching it. You can get these little bumps of awe. As we're talking, there's a wren just absolutely going for it on the tree up there. The tiniest bird with the loudest voice. Notice these things. If you walk through suburban streets on your way home from work, there's a good chance you'll hear a wren. You'll hear blackbirds, particularly in the dusky time. Notice them, Take those moments wherever you can. And if all of that fails, you talked about earlier playing nature sounds, while you're at home. These things are so accessible now. There are so many ways you can get a little bit of a nature fix while you're working, by listening to sound on headphones maybe, if you've got a job that's based in an office. But you can also catch, a 5-minute video on YouTube when you're at home. And again, the research shows that each of those experiences can give you these small bumps in well-being that can add up over time.
That wren was just perfect timing.
So good. I mean, it's my favourite bird, without doubt, the wren.
Yeah.
I love it.
Is that because little but powerful?
I mean, it's like this big, isn't it? And the way that they dance about, and they sort of stand for a moment and they flip their tail and then they're off. They're brilliant.
Just like the wren, Alex has shared his song. He shook his tail and he was off to explore the rest of Eden. Now that was a wonderful encounter, and I have a renewed appreciation of the sounds around me. Whether it's nature documentaries, an audio recording of biophonic sounds, or an ephemeral moment, it always seems to be nature that makes us feel better. I'm going to start looking for opportunities to incorporate more nature into my life, even if it's virtually. I mean, right now, I'm changing my phone screen to a picture of my favourite wild camping trip in the Cairngorms. I want to be reminded of how wonderful that solo experience in nature was, and how special it felt to be alone in the wilderness. And if you've noticed, all of our audio noises that aren't my voice are nature sounds. And now that evidence-based is doing you good. So listening to this podcast is healthy. Even if you don't want to make significant changes, it's beneficial to know that a 5-minute nature video can bump up your mood in day-to-day life. The more I talk to people, the more I realise how tied together with nature we are, and how a lack of connection to it is making both us and nature suffer. So let's look out for ourselves, each other, and for nature. These first 3 episodes are just the beginning for me and the Eden Project on our mission to connect you with people who are doing great things with and for nature. Climate change presents one of the greatest threats to life as we know it. This podcast is going to explore the macro to micro changes, the societal to individual ideas, and the you and me feelings that we have in the face of this challenge. I want to hear from you and what you'd like more of, what you'd like to hear communicated through the podcast medium. This podcast intends to be a collaborative mission in education, curiosity, and inspiring hope. So let's get inspired together. For Conversations in the Canopy, and for all of the wonderful things on this planet, I've been Todd.